Okay, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to PilieroMazza's webinar today on pay transparency requirements. As I'm sure many of you who are joining know, there have just been a new wave and growing number of states that are enacting new pay transparency laws, in addition to salary history bans, and it's just become this sort of new world of pay equity, pay transparency, and so forth. So today we'll be talking a little bit about sort of the evolution of how this all happened and where we are now, to some of the state laws, to the newly proposed FAR regulation rule, newly proposed rule, and then talk about, just some best practices and things to keep in mind. So you go on to the next slide, you can take a look at who will be talking today. So Sara, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Sara Nash. I am a member of PilieroMazza's Labor and Employment Practice Group, where we often deal with these questions of, pay transparency, salary history questions. And as Sara, sorry, there's two of us today, two Saras today speaking to you. But as Sara just mentioned, all these questions asking around salary history and what you have to put in your job posting, it's changing. And especially if you're in a multi-jurisdictional status where you have employees in California or Colorado or DC or Maryland, which is often the case with a lot of government contractors, these laws are going to be particularly relevant to you. So we're often dealing with these questions, and I'm eager to get into it. Thanks, Sara.
My name is Sara Strosser. I work alongside Sara in the Labor and Employment Practice Group here at PilieroMazza, and no need to sort of rehash what Sara mentioned, but we do a lot of work sort of in this field, and I particularly do a lot of work with the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance Programs, the OFCCP. For folks who may know about the OFCCP, I'm sorry if you do, but as you know, there is a big sort of focus on compensation, especially, in the past few years, and pay equity generally. So, we're definitely seeing a growing trend in pay equity enforcement and, trying to gather pay data generally from contractors to the extent that they can. So, and a little bit about our firm, everything on there is pretty self-explanatory, but we do serve, a lot of government contractors and commercial businesses across the United States. So as Sara mentioned, a lot of clients who are multi-jurisdictional are, having sort of issues or want to learn more about what to do, given that they have employees in different states. And now that we're dealing with a growing patchwork of state laws, it's especially important to ensure that, you're well aware of the requirements under each state law as they do differ, unfortunately, and making sure that you're kept sort of in the know with the growing list of states and local laws, I should add. So today's agenda, as I mentioned earlier, pretty short and sweet. I think, a lot of what we're going to focus on today is, some of those state laws that, and we're gonna, we've pulled some of the more, I guess, or the laws that probably require more generally from employers. Of course, there's, a number of states, and we don't necessarily have the time to go through each state law, but we do want to focus on a handful if possible. And then definitely want to talk about the new FAR proposed rule. The comment period ended just a few days ago. We don't have a set date as to when we'll see the final rule, but we should be expecting it, I would say, later this year, right? And Sara can talk a little bit more about that as we sort of dive into that subject. And then we'll talk about a little bit sort of best practices, things to keep in mind, things to watch out for, and things like that. So we'll kind of, do as much as we can as far as giving you the information, but we do want to make sure that to the extent you have any questions or if there are any sort of burning topics or issues that come to mind, please, type them into that chat box, and Sara and I will do as best a job as we can to take a look at that throughout the presentation and try to answer as many questions as we can. As many of you may also know, this program or webinar has been approved for HRCI credit, and we will be providing the code at the end of the webinar, so hang in there with us for the next 40 to 50 minutes, and then we'll provide the code for you all at the end. But again, please, to the extent that there are any questions, we want this to be as interactive and engaging as possible. Please drop them into the chat box, and we'll try to address them as we move along. Okay, so the evolution of pay transparency. So we wanted to talk a little bit sort of about how we got here, right? I think, many of us know throughout the years that the issue of pay equity is not necessarily new. We saw and we are seeing, right, a lot of states and localities issue salary history ban laws, right, where you, in the process of hiring, you're prohibited from asking about an applicant's salary history. And then we sort of got more and more state laws regarding job postings, and top of mind, Colorado comes to mind. They enacted a law a few years ago regarding job postings and ensuring that, salary ranges and so forth were posted in their job advertisements. And then we're going to also talk about paid data reporting, right? So California comes top of mind here. There is a newly enacted law just a few years ago that required, employers of 100 plus employees to annually file pay reports to the state. So, these are just sort of things that have slowly but surely happened and evolved over, the past several years, decades, especially as it goes to the salary history bans. And we're just seeing this trend sort of grow and grow and evolve into these newly enacted pay transparency laws, and, this sort of new pay equity issues that we're seeing more and more of. So let's sort of dive in to the first topic, which is the salary history ban. So as we sort of talked about, these are pretty self-explanatory, right? So these were policies that essentially prohibit employers from inquiring about and or relying on an applicant's previous salary when making hiring and compensation decisions, right? And so a lot of this obviously evolved from the pay disparities in the United States between pay among men and women, among minorities. And so sort of building on this foundation and building on this gender and race gap in pay, we sort of started seeing these salary history bans come into the forefront. More and more states enacting salary history bans and essentially saying to employers, when you're interviewing a candidate, do not ask about salary history, because then, the thought there was by asking folks about salary history, you're just sort of continuing this trend of inequality, and, that it could sort of continue this gender and race gap that sort of has already been established. Now, sort of the recommendation that we tend to give employers and give clients is, well, you can't ask about salary history, but you can ask about salary expectations, right? And so that's sort of the way to ensure that you are complying with these laws if you're in a state where you have a salary history ban in effect. is by asking about job expectations. So again, this was something that sort of came about as an initial matter, and you'll see, for example, in California, the pay transparency law that we just saw enacted, a year or two ago, evolved from a salary history ban law, right? That was enacted, I think, in 2018. And so, initially these laws tend to start out from these salary history bans, and then have slowly sort of evolved into these additional sort of requirements as it relates to job postings and things like that. But that's sort of where this all started, right? It's the salary history bans and ensuring that we're not continuing this trend of inequality by asking candidates and applicants, what their compensation was previously, because then that would sort of, encourage employers to continue sort of using that number and then building and then just continuing with that trend moving forward. So just making sure you're not undervaluing an applicant or an employee based on what they were previously paid. And then we started seeing job posting requirements, right? And so these job posting laws essentially require employers to disclose the compensation or range of compensation in a job posting. So the idea here was, let's provide a little bit more transparency to our applicants and employees as to what the salary expectations are, right? And that way, we're sort of, again, building and evolving this pay equity and pay transparency in that we're just being a little bit more clear and really being transparent about what the job expectations as far as salary are. And these sort of laws also differ by state. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these laws, but, in Colorado, for example, you're required in your job posting to include the range of salary, right, that's expected for each applicable position, whereas in a state like Maryland, you're only expected to provide that salary or compensation upon request. So if an applicant requests that number or an employee requests that number, at that point, an employer is required to provide that information. But, regardless of how it's being asked or what the expectation is, the idea here is let's be more transparent about the compensation that we're providing so that we can ensure that, we're providing compensation that's equitable to all our applicants and all our employees. And then we slowly then evolved into paid, and we'll go back one to the paid data reporting. So these were laws that essentially are requiring employers now to provide paid data reports to the state. And the state that comes top of mind here is California, right? So last year in, I believe, January 2023, we started seeing this new requirement that all employers with 100 plus employees, and regardless of where those employees are, so long as you have one single employee in the state of California, you are required to submit pay reports annually to the state. So this is obviously huge, big step in the world of pay equity. These reports include information not only about the employee's pay, but also demographic information. So, kind of a very, very big development in this pay transparency and pay equity world, because not only are you now required to provide compensation data to your applicants and to your employees, but you're now turning that data over to the state, right? So, and there's penalties that can attach if you don't submit these reports, right? And things like that. So you're starting to see this increased authority from states ensuring that, pay equity is top of mind for employers, and making sure that, you have these obligations and you're essentially turning over that data to the state. You're also seeing it with regard to OFCCP compliance. So in the event of audits, if you're a government contractor and you're subject to an OFCCP audit, you are required to turn over compensation data. Now, there are sort of nuances as to how much of that data you're required to turn over. If some of it has been handled under attorney-client privilege, then you can, ensure that that privilege attaches and just provide sort of a summary of when you conducted, your pay equity analysis and compensation analysis, who did it, what date, things like that, as opposed to turning over the entirety of the compensation data. But regardless, we're still talking about these paid data reporting sort of obligations, and the event that you're up for an audit by the OFCCP, that obligation also attaches. So, just something to keep in mind. We see a lot of, because we deal with a lot of government contractor clients, that this is sort of the piece that they don't expect. They know that they have to turn over all of sort of their affirmative action plans and things like that, we sort of see this, questioning or, trying to understand where this obligation for compensation analysis comes into play. And just sort of as a reminder for government contractors who may be on the line, your compensation analysis needs to be done on an annual basis, right? So the regulations require that you conduct a compensation analysis every year. And so that obligation has always been there. The new sort of obligation or requirement that has come into play here is this requirement to turn over, right, that compensation or paid data to the OFCCP in the event of an audit. And so just something to keep in mind for folks who, again, are government contractors. This is an obligation that you have always had per the regulations, but there is now this new sort of obligation to report or turn over that data in the event of an audit. So OFCCP, especially under the new Biden administration, has been really, really aggressively promoting pay equity, and it's been sort of top of mind. Compensation generally for them, discrimination and so forth has been a big, big driving force and enforcement activity for them. So, something to keep in mind, especially for our government contractor folks in the audience.
Sara, can I jump in? There was a question that I think we can address pretty quickly, mostly because it's sort of a fuzzy answer. The question was raised, what's the positive benefit on the economy of not considering salary history? So most states, and actually this was addressed in the FAR proposed rule as well, consider it a benefit, like this idea of worker satisfaction, pay equity, all of these things contribute to a healthier workforce. And so that's generally the driving force behind this. Ultimately, if you have happier employees who feel that they are more equally compensated, it will lead to an overall benefit on the economy. Who knows if that's accurate, but that's sort of the running theory.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So state laws. So currently we have the list of states here that have enacted pay transparency legislation, and DC is one of the newly, added, not state, but, areas to have passed pay transparency legislation. We also have included a small list of localities that have passed laws. So there is, an additional few that we haven't put on here, but just something to keep in mind. So, especially if you're operating in some of these cities, for example, Jersey City, New Jersey, or New York City, there are specific local pay transparency laws that you need to be aware of, in addition to sort of the statewide pay transparency laws as well. So this is the list. Again, we pulled a few of these just to go through. Obviously don't have time to go through each and every one of these, but you'll see that, depending on where you are, there and where you have employees in, there are going to be different requirements, and the scope of each of these laws is going to be quite different. So let's talk through the first one here, which is good old California.
Can I interject really quickly, Sarah?
Sure.
Just as a PSA to all of our listeners out there, because I feel like this comes up whenever we discuss multi-jurisdictional laws, whether it's sick leave or drug policies. Different states have different requirements. Generally, as a rule of thumb, though, the applicable state law is going to be the law where the employee is employed. So if you've got, following COVID, this is especially a big issue, remote folks who are logging in from their homes, they're based in Colorado or California or, Montana, wherever they are, that's generally the state law that's going to apply. There are some exceptions, but as a general rule, that applies. And so depending on, we're looking at California now where it applies regardless of the number of employees that you have in the state, but generally it's going to come down to where those folks are working and how many people are there to evaluate which state law applies. So I just wanted that primer as people are starting to listen about these specific state laws. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That's a great point, Sarah. Thank you. So for example, in California, we're talking about sort of the full scope of requirements here, right? So under California's pay transparency law, which is now effective 1/1/2023, so over a year ago, employers are required to provide the pay scale for a position to an applicant upon reasonable request, and also, if not an applicant, provide an employee with the pay scale for their current position upon request. Now, if employers have 15 or more employees, this is where that job posting requirement comes into play. So if you have 15 plus employees, you are also required to include the pay scale for a position in any job posting. And if you're using, any of these sort of third parties like Indeed or, Monster, or any of these sort of job recruiting platforms, then you're also required to have those people or those parties publish job postings to include the pay scale in the posting, right? So you can't there's no loophole that if you're not posting the job, you can get away with not posting the pay scale. Regardless, if it's a job position that you are publishing, no matter who's publishing it, you are required to include the pay scale. And what is the pay scale? It is the salary or hourly wage range that the employer expects to pay for that position. So this is sort of, you'll see this job posting requirement pop up in the next slide and under Colorado, but you'll see it varies, right? There's sort of differences in, first of all, the threshold, right? So what employers with how many employees are required to publish these pay scales in their job postings. For California, it's employers with 15 or more employees. And also sort of what that pay scale, right? What information you're actually supposed to provide. And under California's definition, it's that salary or hourly wage range that you expect to pay for that position. So this is California. We also talked a little bit about the paid data reporting requirement in California, which is also new. So again, just to reiterate and mention again for folks, especially if you are operating in California and you have at least one employee in California and 100 or more employees in total, that you are required to annually file a pay report with demographic and compensation data to the state. So you want to make sure that, you're meeting those obligations. Again, I cannot stress this enough, even if you only have one employee in the state of California.
Wow, California manages to do it again. They just never cease to amaze in how they are going to protect those, worker rights. So just another reminder that if you do have folks Especially, in this remote world, if folks are saying, hey, is it okay if I go move to California? That could be a big, impact on your policies and procedures. So make sure you're thinking about it as folks are working more and more remotely.
Exactly. And I see a question here. Can listed pay scale for job postings be expected starting salary range or full pay range, even if don't plan to pay at top of range? Yes. I mean, again, it's sort of that expectation of what you think you would sort of pay, right? So if it's that range of, I think it's going to be between $50,000 to $75,000, even if you don't necessarily plan to pay at top of range. But if it's whatever, it's sort of very discretionary, right, Sarah? I'd say, if the expectation is that you're going to pay somewhere in that range, then that would be where, how you would define that pay scale.
Yeah, I agree. You just want to be able to, have a reason for why you gave the range you did. So any reasonable expectation that you can point to should be sufficient in that context. But it's sort of one of those fuzzier questions of like, how do I know? Maybe if I see a really excellent candidate, I'm willing to provide more. Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, and a lot of this stuff is new. So generally, just make a good faith effort to evaluate what you're looking at. There was another question that popped up here, which asks, what do you do if the position is posted nationwide and you don't necessarily specify California? I think this is going to vary by state law. I know because we're on the Colorado slide that Colorado does take a broad view of that. So if you post a nationwide job posting, then you would have to, the expectation, unless you say not accepting Colorado applicants, would be that you would comply with those Colorado job posting requirements. I don't actually know the answer in California, but my guess would be probably it operates very similarly.
Yeah, I think, it's safe to say that, especially in California, they're going to take a very broad sort of interpretation of that. So, I mean, the same goes with that threshold question. I see a question here regarding, is it employers with 15 plus employees in that one state or a total number of employees throughout all states? It's 15 employees or more throughout, with at least one of those employees currently located in California, right? So it's sort of a similar analysis with the pay data reporting requirement. So long as you have at least one of those 15 employees working in California, then that obligation attaches. So Colorado is also sort of one of those interesting state laws that we wanted to pull and discuss. So, essentially the requirement here in Colorado is that employers must disclose in each posting for each job opening, not only the hourly or salary compensation or range of compensation, right? And again, there's sort of that discretion there, right? So what is that range from lowest to highest compensation that you in good faith, right, and can support with documentation if need be, believe that you might pay for that position. So that's sort of the range. But not only do you have to post disclose the hourly or salary compensation or range, you must also disclose a general description of all benefits and other compensation to be offered if hired. So we're talking about things like paid sick leave or bonuses, commissions, healthcare benefits, things like that. So, Colorado sort of takes it a step further and says, okay, not only do you need to provide the pay, but folks need to know what sort of benefits they're also entitled to, what sort of additional compensation measures they might be entitled to, bonuses, commissions, equity, right, things like that. So, it's a pretty extensive list of things, and as you can imagine, different positions might bring different benefits and then things like that. So having to go through and ensure that you're providing that information can definitely be burdensome. And the disclosure requirements in Colorado apply to, again, similar to California, so long as you have one or more employee in Colorado, then these obligations will attach. So, pretty broad. And Sara, I think we've looked into this, quite a bit. But even if the job posting is for, a remote work opportunity, right? We get questions sometimes, or have gotten questions about, well, this is a remote work opportunity. We don't necessarily know if the position is going to be filled in Colorado or not. Are we still entitled or still required to disclose? And the answer is pretty much yes, right? So, if the position can be filled by someone in Colorado, then the thought here, the state says, if it can be filled in Colorado, then this obligation attaches and you're still required to disclose this information in your job posting. So the only way out of it is if the job to be performed can be performed entirely outside of Colorado, and, has absolutely no relationship whatsoever to the state. In those situations, you don't need to disclose this information. But if there's any sort of tie to Colorado, or if the position can be filled by someone working in Colorado, even if it's a remote work opportunity, then these obligations will still attach.
And someone asks whether it's acceptable to basically say in your job posting that you don't accept California or Colorado applicants. That's technically fine. Although I will remind you, the last part of this presentation, we're going to be talking about the new requirements for government contractors that are coming down the pipe. So yes, you can get around it, but the question might be, how long is that actually going to be an ulterior option?
Yeah. And one more question here. How would the laws apply for third-party recruiting firms that recruit for placement in another company? So I think, and there, if you're reading this otherwise, but, let me know. But I think, for example, in the California law, there's a specific sort of mention of, even if you're having third parties do your postings, they are still obligated to ensure that they're, providing the pay range and providing that pay scale rather in the job postings, right? So, and you're seeing more and more companies, especially bigger companies, kind of have these third-party recruiters come in or do the postings for them, regardless of who's doing it. If the position is going to be filled, in those states, and there are employees in those states, then these obligations will still attach.
That's how I read it as well. There could be some gray area, maybe where you're recruiting generally, but it's not tied to a specific provision or a specific position. But generally, especially in places like California and Colorado and these other states that are passing these laws, they are the same states where they take a really broad reading of employees and recruiting. And so it's going to be difficult to get around the requirements just by engaging a third party.
Right. And the next slide, Maryland. So, the reason why we kind of threw this one in there was just to show the range of, different state laws and requirements. So, California, a lot of different requirements, beyond just the job posting, but also the paid data reporting. Colorado, not only do you have to, post the salary range, but you also post about other benefits and, other sources of pay and things like that. In Maryland, there's a pay transparency law, but all that you're required to do is just provide the wage range for a position upon request, right? So pretty straightforward in Maryland. But, something sort of to keep in mind, again, this goes back to Sara's earlier points about if you're a multi-jurisdictional company, just trying to understand, the full scope of what the different state law requirements are. and, understanding sort of, what the obligations are and which state laws attach and what the requirements are under each. But pretty straightforward in Maryland. If someone's asking for it, you provide it to them, right? So nothing really more than that there. And Sara, I'll let you sort of take over from here, but DC is an interesting one because it's new, and I'm sure a lot of our folks are interested in this one.
Yeah, of course. So DC is one that is scheduled to go into effect June 30th. It's possible that it gets delayed a little bit, but it is likely to be approved just through the processes and procedures of DC statutes. So in DC, similarly, any employers as of, again, June 30th, will be obligated to disclose that same salary range or, hourly wage of any job listings and job position descriptions. So this is similar to those laws that Sara described in California and Colorado. Just going to have to start doing this if you have folks in DC. This range just has to be what the employer in good faith believes it would pay. I think there was a question earlier, like, do you have to go back and revise it if you end up changing things? It doesn't, there's no expectation that people know everything. You just want to be able to point to a reasonable, good faith reason for why you put it at what you did. If ultimately you do have to pay a higher rate to attract really good talent, that's fine. Just you want to be able to explain why you had to go outside of the initial expectation. So just maybe a papering the file sort of general idea about how you're going about this. Importantly, in DC, it's not just going to apply to your new job posting, but it also applies to promotions and transfer opportunities. So just keep that in mind. It's going to have to generally apply to all of your promotional or transferring positions that you might have internally as well. As you can imagine, this is probably a good opportunity to take a look at your current wage structure that you have. Once you do start providing these salary ranges to your new hires, you better believe that your current incumbent workforce is going to be looking at these job postings. So you don't want to be necessarily in a position where you are offering these positions at significantly higher than what your current workforce is making. Is just sort of like a make sure that you've got your house in order before a lot of this stuff goes public, because you could have some repercussions. Just something to think about. Another piece of the, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to tackle one of the questions, but I want you to finish off DC before we get there.
Oh yeah, oh sorry, DC has a lot of fun stuff, so but we can certainly address that. Yeah, so you also have an obligation to disclose to employees before their first interview, so again, that job posting, any benefits that exist. It doesn't have to go into the details of what the value of those benefits are, but you just need a summary, which is pretty consistent with however other laws are applying these types of requirements. There's also a non-retaliation requirement in the new DC law, which essentially prohibits employers from retaliating against employees who discuss their compensation. I'm just using this as an opportunity to remind folks that federal contractors are already subject to a non-retaliation obligation under OFCCP regulations. You are not permitted to retaliate against employees for discussing their compensation. A good reminder that this should already be in your handbooks. If it's not already, let us know. We can provide you some language. Sorry, go ahead, Sara.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Sara. So just a quick question before we move on regarding, I think this was the Colorado law. Someone asked, do you have to be specific about how much you would contribute toward their benefits? Short answer is no. So Colorado essentially just requires that you provide, a general description of the benefits that you are offering for the position. So, something like, $100,000 with competitive benefits. That's not going to work, right? But can you say something like $100,000 with health insurance and 401k, yes, that's fine, right? So you don't need to specifically provide details or dollar values or, you know, premium costs or coverage specifics or anything like that. You just want to just be clear that, you know, you're providing health insurance, you're providing 401k, you're providing a sign-on bonus, right? Things like that, and that should do it. And you want to avoid, I think I remember seeing in the guidance, you know, things like putting et cetera or, you know, additional benefits, you know, language like that. You want to just provide the full list of everything that you would be providing for that position. So, again, not too much detail needed, but you want to make sure that you're providing the extent and the full scope.
Exactly. Okay, now let's dig into this proposed FAR rule that was announced back in January. This, to give everyone some history on what's going on here, back in March of 2022, President Biden executed Executive Order 14069, which is aimed at promoting pay equity and transparency in federal contracting. Now, a couple of years later, the FAR Council has issued this proposed rule. So I do want to make a disclaimer, this is not the final rule. There could be changes. A lot of the rules that we've been seeing coming out have been pretty similar to the initial proposed ones, but there might be some edits, and there are a lot of comments that were submitted in response to this proposed rule. So maybe there will be some changes. So that just means that we don't have a FAR number yet. We do not have a final rule, and we don't even know what the timing looks like. Comments have closed as of this week, which means that we're probably looking at, I don't know, a few months from now. But Sarah, were you going to add something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say comments closed on April 1st, so just a few days ago.
Oh yeah, they just closed. So yeah, we'll see what the final rule looks like when it does come out. A lot of this new rule is going to be very similar to the other state laws that we've been looking at. Remember, as federal contractors, you guys are subject to sort of a heightened standard. It's unfair. Not only do you have to comply with the FAR rule, but you also have to comply with those state rules. So it's sort of this matrix that we're putting together of where you have to comply with certain requirements. Some companies do a one-size-fits-all approach. They say, what's the policy that will get me into compliance in all 50 states? Other companies take a more tailored approach, and they really do carve out compliance according to, you know, not just what their contract says, but also the different states where they navigate within, sort of a dealer's choice of how you want to navigate these rules. But I'll talk a little bit about what these requirements entail. Really quickly, I just wanted to address one question that came in. If a candidate lives in DC and the job is in Maryland, what state law applies? Generally, it's going to be the law of the place where they are applying from. And even as I say that, I'm not sure. I think it's going to vary by the state law. Do you have any insight there, Sarah?
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure as it relates to the DC law. I believe it's going to be Maryland law there, but I can double check and we can get back to folks on the DC specific.
Yeah, that's the other problem with these. It's really going to be in the weeds on some of these things, and a lot of these are new statutes and we don't necessarily have answers, but my guess is we can probably find an answer for that. So we'll reach out to you separately. I think we have your contact information in our chat. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the specifics around this FAR proposed rule. We could go to the next slide. So first of all, it's going to be applicable to all your prime contracts and subcontracts. There is no exception for your commercial items or your commercial products and services, which sort of caused this collective gasp within the government contracting community. It's been the source of a lot of comments that have been submitted, saying that's not the point of these commercial products contracts. So we'll see if that kind of compels the FAR Council at all. But as of now, it's going to be all those contracts where you're performing work within the US, regardless of the dollar amount. So even if you're under that simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently 250,000, this is still an obligation that will apply when the rule does go into effect. The requirements are going to apply to work on or in connection with a government contract. Importantly, this is a really broad application, so it's not just going to be for those positions that are specific, like the work that's specifically called for by the contract. It could also be work that is necessary to the performance of the contract, which is very fuzzy and very potentially broad. So just keep in mind, it's not enough just to post your direct positions. There could be an additional obligation. The hope is that we will get a little bit more clarity on that in the final rule, but in the meantime, it's probably best to assume that it's just a broad application. And then it's going to cover prospective and current employees. Importantly, if you have internal hires or promotions, you still have to comply with the requirements. And so that's just sort of the broad scope look. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a pretty broad law, right? Like it would be sort of, if we're comparing it to some of these other state laws, you know, it's pretty broad. I think it's reflective of the administration's sort of push on pay equity and all the measures that they've taken to date on pay equity. And this is just sort of, I guess, the icing on the cake. And to Sarah's point earlier, you know, we don't have the final rules, so we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I know, you know, there's definitely been comments and concerns raised by, you know, businesses and contractors and so forth, but you know, it's definitely pretty broad as it's written, at least now.
Exactly. And I'll go over a little bit of what those exactly those requirements are. So federal contractors, remember, regardless of size, regardless of whether you're a prime or a subcontractor, have an obligation to disclose the compensation along with a general description of benefits. This is pretty consistent with those state laws we discussed that are applicable to each job posting or job opportunity. Again, it's generally going to be a good faith expectation of what that compensation range is, what those benefits are. It's not the end of the world if it's not 100% accurate, but you do want to be prepared to justify why you went with the range that you did. A lot of the comments have been concerned that this is, you know, confidential and proprietary information. Generally, that has not been a compelling reason for why this should not be required. There's also an obligation to provide applicants with a notice of their rights as either part of the job announcement or the application process. The next slide, I'm not going to get there yet, but we have a summary of what those notice obligations are, and it's pretty intense and does go a step further than what we've seen in prior iterations of these employee-focused regulations. And then lastly, federal contractors are prohibited from seeking or using an applicant or employees' compensation history either directly or, and this is sort of interesting, indirectly. So if an applicant proactively shares their current salary with you, you have to ignore it, essentially. And so it's sort of an additional obligation on these government contractors to not let salary history factor into an employee's compensation determination at all. So just keep that in mind. There are some broad repercussions. Okay, so the next slide shows us, this is the specific notice obligation that is required by the proposed rule. It is pretty detailed. You see that there is not a FAR clause associated with it. Ultimately, it will be in FAR Part 22 or FAR Part 22, this is the notice obligations under FAR Part 52, but we're still waiting for a final FAR number. This is verbatim, as of now, what is supposed to be included in your job postings, or at some point in the application process. I assume you could include this later on or separately, but there is a few things I want to highlight here. First, that first paragraph, you can see there's that job obligation that gives them a notice of this compensation ban history. There's also a very clear instruction on what employees should do if they feel that this obligation has been violated. They give instructions on how to submit basically a complaint to the agency responsible for the solicitation. This means that all of your job postings also need to include the actual agency that the position is for, which is sort of a unique piece of this new rule. Additionally, the obligation is for the agency itself to enforce this. That is atypical. Typically, we have OFCCP from DOL responsible for enforcing these types of mechanisms. So we'll see how agencies handle this kind of new responsibility once it does go into effect. You'll notice, though, that OFCCP did not miss their opportunity for a plug. There's also language in this notice that requires them to alert applicants that they can go to OFCCP for allegations of discrimination on the basis of any of those protected classes. So that is also atypical, not something we typically see in notice obligations. We often get questions from our clients, like, what are policies I need to include in my offer letter? Or what language I have to include in my handbooks? This is just another one of those notice obligations that we will end up adding into that application process. So just important to keep in mind, if you're a federal contractor, once this rule goes into effect, this is something that should be included in that process.
And Sarah, there's a good question here regarding, if this goes through, will the contracting officer have to incorporate this into a contract, or will it just be automatically effective? My understanding is it's going to apply to all those applicable contracts, right? Like it's not necessarily something that needs or needs not be included in the contract, but if I'm reading that incorrectly.
That is an excellent question. And so essentially it's like, is it subject to the Christian doctrine, or is it a specific contractual obligation? Let me see if I can. I just want to pull up the actual language. I don't think it is a creature of contract. In other words, I think it applies regardless, but that's another one that I want to get back to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that could also be part of the gray area right now, because I think that is a great question, right? Is it going to automatically apply, or does it need to be clearly, included in the contract? So, yeah, something we may not have clarity on, but we can certainly sort of go back and double check and get back to folks on this point as well.
Right, exactly. And usually it's a creature of contract. It's like just easy, but ever since DOL implemented the new Davis-Bacon Act regs that basically apply regardless of what's in your contract, there's just a lot more gray area in this sort of spectrum. So I would usually say, don't worry about it, it's creature of contract, but I'm not so certain here, but I can probably figure out the answer pretty quickly. Excellent. Okay, do we have any other?
Yeah, I see a question here. Are senior executive level positions exempt from posting salary ranges? So I can say, under sort of the state laws, specifically Colorado, California, each job posting, right? I think, the language in those states is pretty clear. Every job that is being posted requires the disclosure, right? So there is, at least in those states, no specific exemption for senior executive level positions.
Correct. And there's none in the new proposed rule either. My guess is a lot of the comments are going to be around those. Although remember that as a federal contractor, if you have acquisitions above a certain amount, generally you have an obligation to report your executive compensation anyway, so that might not be an exception. But I'm guessing there will be a lot of comments about the executive positions, and maybe it'll convince the FAR Council to create a exception for certain positions.
The best practices, you know, pretty self-explanatory, I think, but you know, the obvious one here is just familiarizing yourselves with the laws of the states in which you have employees. So just making sure that you understand which states have obligations, and you know, especially as a multi-jurisdictional company, just making sure you're aware of those. And then, as I mentioned earlier, avoiding that question of salary history and sort of turning it into the salary expectation type question. So you're, you know, not running afoul of any of those salary history bands and things like that. So just making sure that, especially, you know, going through your applications, we see it come up quite often if we're reviewing applications, you know, that those questions are still in there. You want to make sure that, you know, those types of questions are removed, and instead you're sort of asking that expectation type question instead. And then the other things are really, right, Sarah, just communicating openly and honestly with your employees. This sort of goes to the whole pay transparency goal, right, is being transparent with your employees and communicating with them regarding, you know, compensation and things like that. And, you know, obviously, depending on the state, if they ask for it, you must disclose it. But, you know, regardless, there is also an opportunity to be open and honest about pay ranges, pay scales, you know, during performance reviews, things like that, that, you know, could, you know, go a long way. And then also preparing those sort of higher up positions, right? Your managers, your supervisors, your HR personnel, preparing them for these types of questions that may come up. Again, under certain state laws, there's an obligation to provide that compensation information upon request. So you want to make sure that, you know, those folks who are very much in the weeds with this type of information are prepared and understand what their expectations and what their obligations are. And then the big one really that we, you know, like to drive home is conducting your proactive pay equity analyses, right? Because ultimately, by taking these proactive measures and conducting these analyses on a proactive basis, then you can sort of get ahead of any potential issues of pay disparity or discrimination and things like that may happen, right? And be able to resolve them before you come up for an OFCCP audit, for example, and that, you know, obviously will turn into much worse news than you want to deal with. So conducting proactive pay equity analyses, you know, again, for government contractors who are subject to the regulations, you know, you're required to do them on an annual basis. If those obligations don't attach to you, I mean, it's still a best practice and still, you know, recommendation that we make to clients, just so you're staying ahead of any potential, you know, issues and disparities that may, you know, come up, even if you don't intend for them to be there. Sometimes, you know, it happens, and you want to make sure you're ahead of it and you resolve it as soon as possible.
Great. And then we just had a couple more questions that came in, try to get those in under the hour. One is, what is the position? What if the position is not directly tied to a specific contract? We've got a couple of this sort of similar ilk. One asks if there are multiple contracts, multiple agencies. I'm guessing we'll get more information once they have a final rule on this point, but there is language in the notice that explains that if an applicant will be supporting multiple agencies, complaints should copy the, central collection point of known agencies. Generally, the idea is that there will be maybe a list of what those agencies should be. If you have back office support folks, I think there's an argument that they don't, even though it's broad, I think there's an argument that they don't necessarily fall under the scope of employees that need to be included. But again, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to hope that the final rule includes some additional context on that. Sarah, we had another question that came in. You might know the answer here. What's the best resource to review state laws for these sort of questions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think really, basically questions that come up, I mean, we can certainly provide any information, and I think we have, a running list of state laws that are enacted at the moment. Otherwise, ultimately, I think it's just staying on top of sort of, your online research and things like that. I don't know, Sarah, if you have other sort of things that come top of mind, but we're certainly keeping a ongoing list, and to the extent that our clients need it, you can certainly provide it.
Two things. One, exactly right. These are fickle. It's really going to want to be the state. Sometimes your payroll provider will provide a nice summary, not always, so depending on the product. The other thing is I want to make sure we're at the hour and we give out the HRCI code. Thank you for that gentle reminder.
Yeah, thank you for that.